Thank you so much for being here and attending this conference. And we have a very exciting panel here today. We have 20 minutes for each speaker, and we'll keep questions and answer sections at the very end. Migration, if in simple word we can put, is all about leaving one's place and migrating to a destination, or coming to a country from another place. And I think this is the topic that the first panelist, Dr. Nourmamadcho, is going to talk about, the arrival of some exciting historical figures in the area of Badakhshan, historical Badakhshan, which includes both Afghanistan, Tajikistan, eastern part of China, as well as northern areas of Pakistan. So we give the panel to Nourmamadcho.
Good morning, and thank you to the organizer of the conference, Hakim and his team, Muzaffar, Yahia, and Amir, for inviting me to this presentation. My topic is called the story of arrival. So this is a story of migration. This is a story of migration, and I will analyze only the opening paragraph of the Tarikh Badakhshan, which is pertained to the migration of 4 religious figures from Iran to the remote mountainous principalities of Shughnan. The presentation divided into 4 sections: the story of arrival, defining chronological boundaries, analyzing the story of arrival, who is Shah Khamush, that I will introduce, and a brief conclusion. So the story of arrival. Drawing on stories from the oral tradition, Qurban Muhammad Zoda and Nourmamadcho Zoda narrate a beautiful story. It is known from early elder people that from the region of Isfahan and the locality of Kashshaf, which is in Iran, 4 wandering dervishes set forth in search of suitable place to set up a permanent residence. These are Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, also known as Shah Kashshaf, Sayyid Shah Malang, Sayyid Shah Khamush, and Shah Burhan Wali. They traveled abroad and eventually came to Shughnan. They took a liking to Shughnan and its natural surrounding and settled there. This is basically the opening paragraph of the Tarikh Badakhshan. And it should be noted that the book is called Tarikh Badakhshan, which is misnomer. The real title of this work is Tarikh Shughnan and the Mountainous Principalities. Defining the chronological boundaries. In its initial stage, the story of arrival reveals the 4 religious wandering dervishes who left a comparatively prosperous life in Iran and took up residence in the remote, isolated mountain principalities of Shughnan. The question that comes to mind at this point are why these wandering dervishes did not choose a life in the central land of Badakhshan, preferring instead to settle in a region as far from the urban centers and as the Pamir principalities. And the second question is that whenever we discuss the arrival of these dervishes, when exactly and how and from where they migrated to the region is very important to discuss. Since the local sources provide complex and contradictory details concerning the arrival of these 4 dervishes, it is important to locate their arrival within an exact or approximate time frame. The spread of the story of arrival in the oral tradition created a web of interconnected narratives that to a certain extent lacks both logical and chronological consistency. A close reading of the paragraph shows that no chronological framework is defined. The story of arrival, the analysis of Russian and British travelers and scholars of the 20th century, place the arrival of all 4 dervishes in the 13th, 15th, and the 4th quarter of the 16th century. Quite strange and unconvincing, however, is another fact that Soviet and Tajik scholars place the arrival of these 4 wandering dervishes precisely in the year 988 or 989, which corresponds to 1581. It's basically the second half of the 16th century. Upon examining these sources, I have been unable to find a date in any local sources. For instance, Haydar Shah Piromshoyev quotes this date on the authority of Tarikh Badakhshan of Okhun Suleiman and Said Shah Fatur. Instead of using dates in their writing, Okhun Suleiman and Said Shah Fatur use broad generic expressions of the immemorial past, such as Odamon Muisafedin Peshin Chonin Shunida Shud, that you can see right on the top of the Persian text, which they highlighted at the time. So if we quote Dr. Aziz Ismail, he says that the sense of a memorial past, which we get in mythical narratives, the sense of long time ago and once upon a time, is the expression of a distance felt within human condition in a here and now. The mythical sense of origin is the sense of ongoing foundation that is narrated in these interviews and discussions. These generic expressions cause a chronological misrepresentation by stretching the time frame for the arrival of these figures retrospectively from modern times to an unknown date in the early period of the spread of Islam to Badakhshan, which might have happened at some point in the 10th or 11th century. In the last decades of the 19th century, Graf Babrinskoy, one of the Russian pioneers of Pamiri studies, interviewed some local peers in Shughnan, Shokhdara, and Wakhon. Despite being explicit in his interview with Said Yusuf Ali Shah, one of the local peers from Porshnev that you can see on the screen, Babrinskoy was very much concerned with the socio-religious aspects of the life of the Ismailis. His interest lay in studying the institution of peership and the authority of peers. Therefore, the historical chronology remains confined to the same generic expression used by elders of Shughnan and later on by many other scholars who repeated it. Here we should admit that the use of these generic terms stem from interviews conducted by British and Tsarist Russian agents like Ni Ilyas, Gordon, Babrinskoy, Zarubin, Snesaryov, Semyonov, and many others, and some of them you can see on the slide. Therefore, it is plausible to argue that it was the lack of those scholars and travelers it was the task of those scholars and travelers who visited the region and interviewed the elders of the local peer to bring forward the issue of at least an approximate chronology. Nonetheless, we can understand from the context of these narratives that it was the interviewee, the descendant of local peers and khalifas, who tried to stick to conventional storytelling, which reflects the sense of a memorial past that I mentioned. The sense of a memorial past, however, seems to be very deceptive. The interviewers had their own agenda and left the chronological discrepancies in the local sources to those interested in scholarly studies of the history of the region. And we can see that modern scholars like Otanbek Mastibekov, Abdul Muhammad Iloliyev, Shaftolo Gulamadov, Daniel Biben, Joan Gross, and many others are deconstructing the story. The interviewers had the chronological gap in treating the local mythical and historical narrative is a common pattern found throughout the mountain principalities. Analyzing the similarity and patterns of these narratives and the use of the broad generic terms mentioned earlier, it would be interesting to look at the extract from Babrinskoy's interview. For instance, Said Yusuf Ali Shah, the Ismaili peer from Porshnev, in his interview states, "Once upon a time, with my ancestor Shah Malang from Khorasan, from the city of Sabzawar, 3 other peers arrived in the mountainous principalities. They are Shah Burhan, Shah Khamush, and Shah Koshan. Shah Khamush took up residence in Kulab, where he passed away. The Mirs of Shughnan consider him their predecessors. Apart from the Mirs of Shughnan, this peer left other descendants, some of whom are living here in Shughnan, and others are living in Kulab. Shah Koshan also left descendants, but none of them are peers. Shah Burhan left no progeny, and the largest number of descendants has been left by Shah Malang and Shah Koshan." As you can see, the sense of a memorial past that I mentioned is present in this description as well. As you can see, the sense of a memorial past is repeated in the report of British and Russian political agents too. A slight variation is revealed in Ni Ilyas's presentation, which is gleaned from the oral interviews he conducted during his visit to the region. A similar pattern emerges from comparing Elias's report with another local source, the Tarikh Mulki Shughnan, the history of the land of Shughnan, which was produced by Sayyid Aydarsho Mubarakshahzoda. It seems safe to assume that Elias collected information in the manner as Babrinskoy and later on Semyonov and many others, namely through dialogue with the local population, which are now analyzed by modern scholars that I mentioned earlier. The story of arrival, the analysis of the work. Bahadur Iskandarov, a prominent Tajik historian, approaches the chronological period of the story of arrival with a certain degree of caution. He uses the local sources, the oral tradition, and the reports of political agents. Iskandarov proposes two possible hypotheses concerning the arrival of these four religious figures. However, it does not disclose his stance explicitly. The first hypothesis proposed by him stems from Qurban Muhammadzoda and Nourmamadchoev that I showed on the screen earlier, which is Tarikh Badakhshan, authenticated by Nasabnoma, or a family tree of Shokhkoshonid Sayyids. From this, Iskandarov concludes, so this is the first hypothesis. It is evident that in approximately 988 or 989, four brothers dressed as dervishes arrived in Shughnan from Isfahan, having passed through Badakhshan in the lake of Shiva. The date mentioned above does not appear in any historical sources. However, the Nasabnoma of Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani or Shokhkoshon provides the date of 1000 Hijri, which corresponds to 1592. There is a little bit of discrepancy, but the date was found in the modern time, which was mentioned in an article by Joanne Gross, which was published in 2022, technically 2 years ago. Furthermore, where Babrinskoy, Elias, and the other local sources refer to these four wandering religious mendicants as four dervishes, Iskandarov, for some reason, makes them four brothers. The second hypothesis is a short analysis of Gordon and Minaev's account, followed by a summary of the first hypothesis. Iskandarov combines them and for some unknown reason reverses his conclusion to the conventional local narrative story. In relating the account of Gordon and Minaev, we can see that both authors have attempted to give a detailed analysis of the story. Neither of them, however, placed the arrival of these dervishes in one historical period, and their analysis is mainly focused on the figure of Shokhkomush only, which I will discuss a bit further down. Therefore, the implicit conclusion is that Shokhkomush arrived in the region much earlier than the other three dervishes. At this point, the objection can be made that it was the lack of sources that compelled not only Iskandarov, but other Soviet scholars as well to simply describe the story of arrival. Another account of the arrival of these four dervishes is found in the Tarikh Badakhshan of Mirza Sang Muhammad Badakhshi and Fazl Bek Surkhafzad. This work provides important historical documents which were added as a supplement to this Tarikh. The first document is titled The Genealogy of Mirzan of the mountainous region of Shughnan. This document appears to be a compilation of famous names that you can see on the screen, where the author furnishes a list of all prophets together with the 12 Shi'i imams and some other important saints. Admittedly, the confusing part of this genealogy is evident in the absence of historical chronology and the sources on which this genealogy is based. The second document, entitled The Life of Shokhkomush, who is the predecessor of the Mirza of Shughnan, this document presents a narrative story which also stems from local oral tradition. However, Fazl Bek Surkhafzad states that the genealogy of Shokhkomush is based on the family tree of the local rulers, the Mirza Shahs of Shughnan, known as Shajara-e Sadat, or the genealogy book of the noble Sayyids. The selected excerpt from the Shajara-e Sadat quoted in Tarikh Badakhshan provides some details about the life of Shokhkomush, yet even this convoluted story does not provide the true religious identity and the time of Shokhkomush. The question that comes to mind at this point is who is then Shokhkomush, which I will briefly discuss further down. So who is Shokhomoush? Fazlali Bek Surkhafsar, in his supplement to the Tarikh Badakhshan, records the real name of Shokhomoush as Sayyid Mir Hassan Shah, and tells us that he was born in Isfahan in 1065-66. His miraculous abilities started to become apparent at the age of 12. His father is named as Sayyid Aidar. The supplement in the Tarikh Badakhshan claims a Sayyid descent for Shokhomoush's father, linking him to the family of Imam Hussein bin Ali. Until he reached 21, Shokhomoush studied the sciences of religion and theology under the guidance of his father. His maternal lineage meant that he was an Owaisi Wali. Furthermore, we learn from the same sources that his mother and that of Abdul Qadir Jilani were sisters and daughters of a certain Sayyid Abdullah Sawmai. When Shokhomoush reached the age 21, he set off on pilgrimage. Prior to his journey to Mecca, he stayed in Baghdad for several years. However, the text does not specify the precise duration of his stay in Baghdad. The Tarikh Badakhshan narrates that Shokhomoush set off for pilgrimage in the company of Abdul Qadir Jilani, which seems a bit odd. Simple mathematical calculation, however, must repudiate this account on the following grounds. If Shokhomoush traveled to Baghdad when he was 21 years old, it would mean that that this event took place in the year 1086. At this time, Abdul Qadir Jilani was only 9 years old and could not have traveled to Baghdad on his own. Modern studies demonstrate that Abdul Qadir Jilani was sent to Baghdad in 1095, at which time he was only 18 years old. He traveled to Baghdad to pursue the study of the Hanbali law. This would imply that while Abdul Qadir Jilani engaged in his studies, Shokhomoush reached the northern mountainous region of Shughnan. On these grounds, we may safely argue that the story of Shokhomoush in the Tarikh Badakhshan is partly spurious, as the author tends to appropriate the figure of Shokhomoush and shows him as a Hanbali scholar or a Sufi or a Sunni Sufi. The fact that the story is spurious is also shown in another section, as well as in another section. Where the author says that he met Junaid al-Baghdadi, a celebrated Sufi of the 12th century. The story says that Junaid al-Baghdadi commanded Shokhomoush to visit Khatlan or Khotalan in the company of Shomalang, Shokoshan, and Bobo Mariumgi. I argue elsewhere that Shomalang and Shokoshan traveled to Badakhshan sometimes at the end of the 15th or second half of the 16th century, while Junaid al-Baghdadi passed away in 910, which is more than 150 years before the likely birth of Shokhomoush. Nonetheless, Fazl Bek Surkhafsar describes the journey of Shokhomoush to Shughnan as follows. Shokhomoush set forth in the company of 4 people and reached the bank of the Panj River, traveling through India, Chitral, Dardistan, and passing the Duroha Pass. From there, he continued to Shughnan. All of the inhabitants of Shughnan became followers of Shokhomoush, and he started to teach the local population the science of theology and the rules of faith. Afterwards, he cured the 14-year-old daughter of the ruler of Shughnan, who as a sign of gratitude offered his daughter to him in marriage. They married in 1096. The descendants of Shokhomoush until today are the great princes and Ishans of Kohistan. Some of them are occupied with mundane rule, while the others teach the religion as murshids and peers. One can also propose another hypothesis according to which Shokhomoush was sent to Badakhshan and the Pamir principalities from Iran during the Alamut period. The above passage gives a hint in support of this hypothesis on chronological ground. However, it repudiates the argument of Piromshoev and to a certain extent the first hypothesis of Iskandarov regarding the arrival of Shokhomoush in the region at some point in the 16th century. However, it does raise question regarding the religious identity of Shokhomoush. As we learned earlier, Shah Khamush was a Hussainid Sayyid from his paternal line and an Owaisi Sufi on his maternal side. This leaves us with several options, namely that Shah Khamush was either an Ismaili Da'i, a Sunni Sufi, or even a 12 Shi'i religious scholar, an alim. In other words, we cannot prove or deny the possibility that he was an Ismaili Da'i or had an affiliation with other religious confessions. Conclusion. A number of sources from Badakhshan, such as wasaiq or judicial decrees from the shrine of Nasir Khusraw, published in 1959 by Khalilullah Khalili, demonstrate that the figure of Nasir Khusraw was transformed from an Ismaili Da'i to either Sufi religious scholar or a Sunni religious scholar. Therefore, it seems reasonable to assume that the figure of Shah Khamush may also been transformed from an Ismaili Da'i into a 12 Shi'i or Sufi Darwish, all of which shows that the religious identity of Shah Khamush, Shah Koshon, and Shah Malang as foundational figures remain in a state of continuous change. The story from the Sunni milieu present them as a Sunni scholar, while the Ismailis of the modern mountainous principalities of Shughnan, they remain in Ismaili Da'i and the messengers from the side of the Imam. The Mirs from the lineage of Shah Khamush remained in control of the political realm, while the Pirs from the lineage of Shah Koshon and Shah Malang remained in charge of the religious life in the region until the end of the 19th century, when colonial power divided the region between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. Thank you.
Fascinating story, and shows how complex is not only history and genealogy, but also identities of different people. And moving from Persia and Iraq to Central Asia, I think it's the time to move from Central Asia to India to see how the elites and different figures, administrators, Sufis have managed to bring cultural and political changes with them in trans-regional mobility. It's time to welcome Dr. Kashshaf Ghani, who has come all the way from India for this conference. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and a warm thank you to the Institute of Ismaili Studies for the kind invitation. Standing in the midst of this very fine congregation of scholars working on Central Asia, on other fields of studies, I'll begin with a frank confession. My area of specialization is not on Central Asia or Central Asian studies, but primarily as a scholar of pre-modern medieval South Asia, I am not distant or immune from the developments and the deep connections which South Asia has endured with the region of Central Asia and the larger neighborhood over a long period of time. And I look into the region of Central Asia standing in the historical context of pre-modern South Asia. And particularly for that reason, I am deeply thankful to the organizers of the conference for allowing me to share some of my ideas, looking at it from a different geocultural location, where I quickly try and bring together before you three interconnected processes of textual writing, Sufi piety, and architecture in the next 20 minutes or so. So without any delay, I'll straight away move ahead with the presentation. So at the turn of the second millennium, Central Asia emerged as a hub of culture and intellectual productivity, which contributed significantly to civilizations in Asia and Europe. Though this was primarily driven by scholars trained in Arabic, the nascent language of New Persian would soon emerge as an important vehicle for this cultural and intellectual flourish, spreading across the core territories of Central Asia as far as northern India. With the weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate, these lands emerged as cradles of powerful sultanates. The Samanid, Khwarizm, Ghaznavid, and Ghurid, who controlled and secured major trade routes that crisscrossed in all directions, carrying not only goods, but cultural practices and intellectual traditions far and wide. Such conditions, then, were also conducive for the growth of large urban cities like Nishapur, Balkh, and Bukhara, which combined with the presence of multiple religious traditions like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, gave a multilingual and cosmopolitan character to the region. Notwithstanding India's centuries of trade connections and networks of mobility which connected the subcontinent to the northwestern frontier regions and beyond, its integration into the Persianate world of Central Asia can be marked from the early 11th century. The period witnessed the rise of the powerful Ghaznavid Sultanate in eastern Afghanistan, when military commanders of the declining parent Samanid kingdom in Bukharan Central Asia decided to grab the opportunity of a political career, thereby relocating to Ghazni. The new Sultanate came to be ruled by Turkish-speaking Central Asian slaves like Alptigin and Sabuktigin. It was the latter's son, Mahmud, who led dozens of raids into northern India, plundering wealth and resources back to Ghazni. The plundered booty from India would be utilized to recruit more Turkish mercenaries and slaves, who in turn would drive future raids into Central Asia and Iran. These raids also introduced a particular style of warfare in Hindustan, hitherto unseen. Mahmud's army functioned as a highly skilled cavalry machine which required regular recruitment of Turkish slaves as well as freemen from Central Asia. Beyond the urban centers where pastoralism was the way of life, young boys grew up in an environment where fine quality horses were bred and subsequently acquired the basic skills of riding them, and eventually the exceptional ability to shoot arrows at full gallop in all directions. Many of these Central Asian slave mercenaries would settle down from time to time in the frontier regions of northwestern India like Rajasthan and Punjab and even beyond. In the period after Mahmud, the Ghaznavids lost their possessions to their former vassals, the Ghurids, who were free pastoral chieftains from the remote mountains of Afghanistan, ethnically and culturally distinct from the Central Asian Turks who lavishly patronized the cosmopolitan Persian culture. The chiefs of Ghur, Muizuddin Muhammad in particular, was responsible for leading a series of victories in the east through the tested combination of Central Asian warriors and war horses, culminating in the defeat of the Rajput royalty in the late 12th century. This allowed him to establish a political base in North India and legitimately claim themselves as rulers of a fledgling sultanate that stretched across North India, Afghanistan, and Khorasan. But this experiment of a trans-regional sultanate was not to endure for long, as the western territories of the weakening Ghurid Sultanate was extinguished by their rivals, the Khwazam Shahis. The eastern territories came to form the regional sultanate around Delhi from the early 13th century, controlled by Iltutmish, a slave of Muizuddin's trusted slave, Qutbuddin Aibak. In the early days of their political authority, the sultans of Delhi had to wake up to a pan-Eurasian phenomenon unfolding beyond their immediate frontiers. Between 1219 and 21, the Mongols under the leadership of Genghis Khan burst into Central and West Asia from their homeland in Eastern Asia. In what would turn to be a military calamity for the Islamic world, the Mongol devastation culminated in the momentous decline of Baghdad and the disappearance of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. In the meantime, a string of stunning military victories combined with the recognition from the Caliph had secured the position of Iltutmish as the supreme authority of the Delhi Sultanate, which stretched all across northern India. With the decline of major Central Asian urban centers and eventually Baghdad, Delhi emerged as a global city and the single most important center of the Islamic world in the Eastern Hemisphere. Quite understandably then, it became the natural refuge not only for thousands of terrified souls who struggled to escape the Mongol fury, but for the faith of Islam as well. Delhi came to be seen as the refuge of faith, the Deen Panah. The sultans of Delhi perhaps realized the enormity of this migration, which had the potential for wiping off memories connected to once flourishing regions. Thus, localities or muhallas, where immigrants came and settled in Delhi, were named after their once geographical roots, such as the Khwazam Shahi or the Samarkandi. The desire was to preserve a fast disappearing history. While the large number of Central Asian refugees, from nomads to town dwellers to Sufi saints, scholars, and soldiers, sought political stability and a secure livelihood, the sultans of Delhi saw this as an opportunity to project their image as a benevolent protector, nurturing human capital which could secure the foundations of his kingdom. Though the culturally elite Persian speakers arriving from Iran and Central Asia as scholars, Sufis, and writers faced the uncomfortable reality of remaining politically subservient to powerful Turkish slave commanders, they excelled in the important task of writing and circulating official histories in Persian. These texts, produced from royal courts and focusing on the aspects of history, governance, contemporary politics, and norms of kingship, provided the valuable institutional basis for these states within the Persianate world. One such scholar in my first case study was the historian Minhaj Siraj Juzjani, whose Tabakat-e-Nasri, written in the Tabakat style, is the foremost account on the early history of the Delhi Sultanate. The work is valuable for its histories of the Central Asian dynasties till his own times. Minhaj was born in Xinjiang in eastern Khorasan in the closing years of the 12th century, in a family of reputed scholars and bureaucrats who had served multiple dynasties in Central Asia. He too had to travel extensively across Central Asia, Iran, and Afghanistan in pursuit of education and employment opportunities. The scholar was an eyewitness to the turmoil in Central Asia that accompanied the ascendancy of the Mongols, as well as the political, cultural, and demographic outcomes of this encounter. The last section of his work is valuable for its account on the Mongols. Minhaj fought against the Mongols with the aim to defend his homeland, but within a volatile political landscape when Khorasan was eventually occupied, he was forced to migrate to Sindh in 1227, following his Ghurid patrons. He was eventually invited to serve at the royal court of Delhi. Having lived through the Mongol Holocaust, Minhaj completed his work in 1260, just 2 years after the Mongols extinguished Baghdad. His work then captures a deep state of crisis at two planes. Firstly, his personal loss of homeland and the forced relocation to India. Secondly, lands in the West slipping out of Darul Islam with the execution of the Abbasid Caliph. He reflects on this by remarking that, I quote, "All the lands of Turan and the East have come under the sway of the infidel Mongols. Darul Islam has left those lands which have become Darul Kufr," unquote. At the same time, the migration of Muslim believers from Central Asia to North India or Hindustan for Minhaj turned this very region into, I quote again, "the focus of the people of Islam and the orbit of the possessors of faith," unquote. The land of Hindustan, by virtue of offering shelter to numerous migrants forced to leave their home and hearth, was being imagined and accepted as the heartland of the Islamic world. More so when we contextualize this historical phenomenon against the calamity of the Baghdad's demise. Over a period of time, the next century, these very immigrants began to identify themselves less along binaries of Muslim and non-Muslim, but more as inhabitants of Hindustan alongside their non-Muslim neighbors. This transition in their identity from a Central Asian to Indian crystallized particularly in the wake of the relentless Mongol incursions into northern India. Between 1220s and the next 150 years, till the 1370s, different factions of Mongols raided India's northwestern territories that were defended by the armed contingents of the Delhi Sultanate. These armies, comprised of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, which chroniclers like Abdul Malik Isami, writing in the 14th century, described homogeneously as Indian ranks, or the Safe-Hindian. By referring to Hindian, Isami was clearly indicating an armed contingent of mixed social and religious identities, local non-Muslims, as well as Muslims of local origin, along with migrants like Minhaj. Movement and migration then, in this case from Central Asia to Hindustan, followed by the resettlement of such uprooted communities, helped forge notions of territory conceived by individuals like Minhaj through imaginations of the Darul Islam. The idea of sacrality which Minhaj was trying to conceive encompassed only North India. That is a territory ruled by the sultans of Delhi, contrasted with Khorasan, the land overrun by the pagan Mongols. At the other end from Delhi, a different experience of politics and patronage then informed Juwaini's authoritative account on Genghis Khan, the Tariq-i-Jahan Gusha. Completing his work in the same year, in 1260, Juwaini weaved praise and applaud for the great Khan, describing the Mongol onslaught as God's curse on Muslims for leaving the path of righteousness and the outcome of a depreciating moral piety. Standing in the 13th century then, the imagination of an Islamic territory required more than simply demographic figures, bolstered by Central Asian immigrants, which at a later point also included the Mongols. It required also the blessings, through physical presence, of course, of a community of charismatic spiritual personalities, the Sufi sheikhs. Looking back, scholars in the 14th century readily institutionalized the belief that, I quote, "the world is bound up closely with that of the men of faith," unquote. These men of faith, or Sufi saints, are identified as possessing special nearness to God, hence their claim as the guardians of God's earthly domain. I quote again, "although there might be a monarch in every country," unquote, "these kings are temporarily leased out earthly authority by the grace of spiritual and powerful sheikhs." At the time when the territories from Punjab to Delhi were being populated by displaced immigrants from beyond the Khyber, India's earliest Sufi orders arriving from Central and West Asia were the Chishti and the Suhrawardi, along with dervishes from Kubrawi, Yasavi, and Kalandari traditions. While the Suhrawardi saints arriving from Baghdad chose to settle in Punjab, the Chishtis moved further, till their first Indian master, Muinuddin Chishti, decided to settle in Ajmer. Sufis of this order traced their origins to Chisht, a remote village near Herat in Khorasan, through the personality of the 10th century master Abu Ishaq Shami. After he decided to settle down in Chisht, Abu Ishaq was advised by his master to change his epithet from Shami to Chishti. Contemporary records on Muinuddin Chishti are rare. It is from later tazkiras or biographies that his story is reconstructed. He was born in Sijistan and brought up in Khorasan. Muinuddin stayed in Samarkand and Bukhara learning Quran and theology. Thereafter, he reached Harwan near Nishapur, where he received spiritual training under Usman Harwani. After completing his training, he set out to travel extensively across Central West Asia, Iraq, and Persia, where he benefited from the company of living Sufis, while at the same time seeking blessings at the shrine of bygone saints. He eventually decided to travel to Hindustan after leaving Ghazni. His arrival is believed to have coincided with the establishment of the Sultanate of Delhi. Though Sufis are characterized by extensive travel and mobility, evident in Muinuddin's own travels, the Central Asian practice of the Darwishi, influenced by the Kalandari tradition, evidently took a backseat in favor of a sedentary life once they arrived in Hindustan. Take, for instance, Muinuddin's principal successor in Delhi, Bakhtiyar Kaki. The saint was born in Osh in Transoxiana and was well familiar with Malamati and Kalandari practices. It is said that sometime during his travels in Baghdad, he received initiation in the hands of Muinuddin. After Muinuddin left Baghdad, Bakhtiyar Kaki returned back to travel extensively through Khorasan. When he chose to follow his master to India, the saint first reached Multan but was advised by Muinuddin to settle in Delhi. Giving up their mobile lifestyle, Chishtis functioned through institutions like the Khanqa that came to serve as a center for training where the neighboring community could come in contact with the saint and seek his blessings, as well as a geographical marker for Sufi traditions in India. Yet for the early generations of Chishti Sufis who migrated to India, distancing from their Central Asian spiritual training was easier said than done. Muinuddin asked his disciple Hamiduddin Nagori to write down the rules of the path, effectively the earliest set of written advisory members for the Chishti fraternity, which included abstention from a series of practices like government service, earning money, borrowing money, hoarding, seeking help in terms of poverty, government aid, and others. And in return, emphasizing on an equally long list of practices like fearing God, respecting one's peer, regular fasting, spending nights in contemplation, among others. These principles were in fact drawn almost completely from the teachings of renowned Central Asian Sufi masters like Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, Khwaja Abdullah Ansari of Herat, and Ainul Quzat Hamadani. The Chishtis also carried to Hindustan, at least in their early careers, the influence they received from the Central Asian Kalandari tradition. Asceticism and detachment from government service were the noticeable ones, as evident from the early rules of the Chishti path. The Chishtis also carried the practice of spiritual initiation through the shaving of the head, which symbolized the renunciation of worldly attachments through removal of impurities. Muinuddin is said to have practiced the ritual of Sama in his pre-Indian career as the act of putting poetry to music for spiritual ecstasy. And it became an accepted practice among Sufi brotherhoods in Central Asia and Baghdad way back from the 10th century. Muinuddin legitimized this practice to such an extent that he is credited with introducing the practice of Sama in Hindustan as the cornerstone of Chishti spiritual experience. Yes, thanks. And finally, the articulation of authority in a geocultural space, much different and diverse, can be challenging to say the least. For the sultans of Delhi, the early attempt at projecting authority through visual edifices like the Jami Mosque of Delhi and the Qutub Minar complemented the actions of the scholars and the presence of Sufis. It adhered to a well-established practice of architecture where tall minarets across Persianate Central Asia proclaimed the presence of powerful states. The Ghurids followed this very model when they constructed the towering circular plan minaret in their own backyard in Jam, Firozkoh. Sponsored by Yeah, so this elaborately decorated structure was also attached to a mosque. The flanked shape of Delhi's Qutub Minar is said to have been inspired by the other two minarets, similarly styled in Ghazni. An inscription on the minaret of Delhi shares the name of the supervisor as Fazl ibn Abil Mali, who was also in charge of the Jami Mosque before Amir Ko subsequently completed the minar during the reign of Iltutmish. The Central Asian connections to the construction of the Qutub Minar are not altogether absent. Some of the similarly styled minars, which could have possibly served as models inspiring the Delhi project, was the one at Jar Kurgan near Tirmiz, early 12th century, bearing resemblance with the second story of the Qutub. The Minar-e-Kalan at Bukhara, which could have offered ideas for the balconies of the Qutub. And finally, the Minar at Wabkend, late 12th century. The innovative idea of the Quranic inscriptional bands, which you see on the body of the Qutub in bold relief, right, could have been inspired by the mausoleum in Uskund, again late 12th century, where the Quranic inscription was done in a floral setting. To conclude then, historically the connections between India and Central Asia stretching back several centuries have been complex and multi-layered. With the coming of Islam into the region and the region's integration into the Persianate world, newer dimensions were added to practices of movement and migration. To begin with, it pulled South Asia for the first time into the wider orbit of the Persianate world through the formation of large polities like the Delhi Sultanate. It created a permanent opportunity for individuals and communities to seek a career in Hindustan, thereby coming to terms with different socio-economic and political realities. With the eruption of the Mongols, the promise of professional gain became inextricably tied with personal loss, as many witnessed their birthplace fading into a painful memory. For individuals like Minhaj, who experienced forced migration, Hindustan was imagined not only as the new homeland, but also the last refuge of the Islamic faith. Blessing this new territory, hence facilitating its transition from Darul Harb to Darul Islam, were Sufi saints, charismatic holy men arriving from Central Asia and Iraq. Given their critical role in sanctifying the land of Hindustan, later hagiography remembers pioneer saints like Muinuddin Chishti being instructed in a dream to proceed towards Hindustan by none other than the Prophet himself, to raise the flag of Islam. Trained outside India, Sufis not only transported a unique vision of spirituality and religious devotion, rather combined it with the critical activity of local community formation through dynamic social interactions. Finally, by focusing on material culture, like the earliest Jami Masjid and the minaret, I have tried to emphasize how new styles of artistic practices were arriving in Delhi. Like scholars and Sufis, migrant architects too needed to engage with specialized local craftsmen to translate complex projects like the Qutub complex into a reality. Although the use of aesthetic forms like calligraphy on the surface could be achieved, specialized architectural features of the arch and the dome were beyond the reach of Indian workers. Therefore, taken together, these important interconnected trends are emblematic of the plurality of outcomes triggered by Central Asian migrations to India. Studying these complex practices across rapidly changing historical context allows us to get a sense of the interesting ways in which mobility facilitated physical relocation as well as transmission of rich ideas. This is evidently a very layered history which deeply impacted pre-modern South Asia, where it remained profoundly intertwined with state formation and social interaction. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kashshaf Ghani, for a fascinating presentation about trans-regional mobility in terms of politics, history, spirituality, and architecture, everything. Thank you very much. We move on to the last speaker, Dr. Amir Saidula from the Institute of Ismaili Studies, who will talk to us about the Wakhi settlers in the South Xinjiang province of China and how these settlers are dealing with the socio-cultural context of the region. The floor is yours, Dr. Amir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yahya. Thank you, everyone here and online. We will set up a little bit of short context, then we will look at the migration, integration, and articulation of identity by the Wakhi settlers in Guma County in Khotan Prefecture in Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region. Where's the thing? Okay, without further ado, let's start. There's too much to talk about. China. People's Republic of China is a multicultural modern nation state. It officially recognizes 56 nationalities, or minzu, known as. And as an atheist state, it does not openly recognize religion as identity marker as such, but larger minorities with territories, autonomous territories, and independent distinctive culture are always associated with some sort of religious identity. Accordingly, 10 out of 56 nationalities are recognized as Muslim minorities, or in Chinese, 穆斯林少数民族. These Muslim communities exhibit significantly ethno-linguistic diversity and can be broadly categorized into two categories, cultural categories: the Mandarin-speaking Hui, the Chinese, and the ethno-culturally Central Asian Muslims of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Xinjiang for you. The Tajiks are one of the 56 official nationalities and are considered as one of the 13 historical inhabitants, or Shiju Minzu, of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Despite their numerical insignificance, they are the largest Shi'i Muslims in China. Officially classified as the only Caucasian Mediterranean race indigenous to China, ethno-linguistically, Xinjiang Tajiks share connection with Eastern Iranian-speaking, predominantly Ismaili Tajiks of Badakhshan or Pamir areas. Within the context of Xinjiang, however, the term Tajik comprises diverse communities sharing certain racial, ethno-linguistic, and cultural traits, each with unique historical histories and ancestries. Xinjiang Tajiks can be roughly categorized into 4 subgroups based on factors like their mother tongue, geographical distribution, and memories of their ancestral homeland. These subgroups are the Sarikolis, Wakhis, Tarlegs, and Kanjudis. While scholars and specialists know this internal diversity, but it usually gets lost in the media and other information sharing platforms. Despite their differences, these Tajik groups share a sense of collective identity fostered by subscription to a historical narrative tracing their origin back to the prehistoric Eastern Iranian inhabitants of Tarim and Turfan Basin. However, a closer examination of the narratives of these subgroups reveals a more complex history of human movement and interaction consistent with the demographic shifts along this ancient thoroughfare. The Wakhi story in South Xinjiang, for instance, reifies this ongoing demographic dynamism. The areas where the Wakhi people settled in Xinjiang consists part of a connected geography that is close to traditional Wakhi homelands outside China. Daftor village, for instance, the biggest Wakhi settlement in Tashqoran County and the first town when you cross from Khunjra Pass from Pakistan to China, sits right at the eastern end of Wakhan corridor, and it's separated from Pakistan by the Karakorum mountain. Both sides are Wakhi people, first village. Some local historians propose that the migration eastward from the traditional Wakhi homelands coincides with the Mongol expansion into Central Asia. Nonetheless, the prevailing body of the records indicates that these settlers established themselves in their present locations over the past 5 centuries, notably commencing from actually mid-17th century. It has been believed that their displacement from their native land was prompted by constant conflicts and imperative to evade conscription to Afghan army. That was the case mostly during the colonial period. Though the Wakhi connection of these settlements is not explicitly mentioned in Chinese sources, contemporary Chinese sources, oral traditions suggest that their ancestors came from Wakhan corridor and Badakhshan areas a few generations back. And Nourmamadcho is one of the Wakhi settlements with over 300 years of history in Xinjiang. Their experience illustrates the complexity of human migration, adaptability, and identity formation at the geocultural margins of Chinese state. Tajiks. Okay. Known as Nourmamadcho Tajik ethnic township, the Wakhi settlement in Guma County is one of the 4 Tajik ethnic townships that's not part of Tashqurghan. And it is the only Tajik enclave within Khotan prefecture. Located roughly 68 kilometers to the southwest of Guma County, where Karakorum and Pamir Mountains converge, it is the most eastern Tajik settlement in Xinjiang. It was established as Nourmamadcho Tajik Autonomous Township in 1954, and in 1984, the autonomy title was dropped and changed to Tajik Ethnic Township. Spreading over 5,000 square kilometers, the township consists of Kengaz, Akshu, and Buchung villages. According to 2018 census statistics, the township has 1,083 people and 970 registered as ethnic Tajiks. So how these people ended up in this part, so far from Wakhan corridor? According to official storyline, their ancestors arrived from Wakhan Kingdom at around 1650s. They came in groups. The earlier ones joined the existing Wakhi settlers in Daftor Township, which was already populated by Wakhan people at the time. And about 17 families moved further eastward and settled in present Guma County. Out of the 17 families, 8 families led by Ghulam Haidar, Abdul Karim Haji, Hushur Ahmad, Almirak Bigmad, and Ismail settled in Akshu village. And other 9 families led by Muhammad Haq Boy, Gharib Boy, Hazim Boy, Taimush, Darwish Boy, and Gul Boy settled in Kingaz village. Then they gradually expanded into Buchung village. The areas they settled in was part of Yarkand Khanate at the time. It was empty land, but owned by landlords in neighboring Kiliang village. They bought the land and the surrounding highland pasture lands, and they began the settlement, building houses, reclaiming agricultural lands, and raising livestock in the mountains. They succeeded, and over time, the settlement was officially recognized as a part of Yarkand Khanate, and the Wakhis became the subjects of Eastern Chagatai dynasty, later the Jungars and the Qing dynasty, and their modern successors, the nationalist and the communist government. During the Qing, the last feudal dynasty that ruled China between 1644 to 1911, it was part of southern Xinjiang governorate and ruled from Yarkand. We know very little about their administrative structure until the Republican period, and that was when Nourmamadcho was made a village under Guma County, which was later inherited by the communist government in 1949. Their interaction and experience with the authorities thereafter attests that they have become part of local story or history, if you like. For instance, during the colonial period, when the British Empire vied for influence in South Xinjiang, some of the local political and economic elites in the region acquired British citizenship, thus defying the Chinese officials and refusing to pay local taxes. With the help of a certain Abdul Karim Qasim Aksakal, the British agent at the time in Guma, some prominent Wakhi religious leaders and wealthy landlords, like namely Jumada Mullah, Nurullah Mullah, Dölet Beg, Dustali Aksakal, and Qurbanjan Mullah also acquired British citizenship and openly ignored the Chinese governor of the county, thus forfeiting their Chinese nationality. That decision actually came back to bite them half a century later, and they paid dearly for that. And it also implicated the entire village, the settlement. During the Republican period, with the backing of Russians for empire, then the Soviet Union, the nationalist governor of the province expelled British Aksakals and confiscated their wealth. Consequently, the residents of Nourmamadcho was rounded up in Kiliang village and accused of colliding with foreign powers. Since the community leaders were British citizens, the villagers were also treated as foreigners, and an ultimatum was issued, compelling them to either leave the country or pay 12 silver bullion to restore these Chinese citizenship. For the rich, it was easy, the guys who started it. It was the poor guys, impoverished peasants, who forced to take out loans from their rich and repay their debts by performing unpaid labor for many years. To avoid forced expulsion, some families fled to other parts of the region and concealed their identity. Around 1930s, Sheng Shicai, the then military governor of Xinjiang, rounded up 75 influential local leaders in Goma who previously had British citizenship, and under the pretext of a meeting, and they secretly executed and buried them in an unknown location in the nearby desert. It was intended to prevent such collaboration with foreign powers from happening again. Among them were some Wakhis. Some say it's 4 or 5, one say 3, need to be ascertained. The Wakhi culture in Nourmamadcho showcases a conscious process of cultural bartering, while keeping the key cultural markers that define the ethno-linguistic identity. They also adopted some rites, rituals, and practices from their Sunni neighbors. The adjustment, in return, helped them to fit in and integrate with, while sustaining the salient components of their ethno-linguistic heritage. In order to minimize interaction with other communities, they consciously avoided cross-cultural marriages and resisted marrying their daughters outside the community, effectively mitigating the cultural impact of surrounding areas in their internal socio-cultural life. It was instrumental for passing on the Wakhi language, culinary and sartorial traditions, and adhering to certain social norms and values, while making some allowances for cultural integration. That said, as a result of generations of coexistence and intermingling with their Turkic neighbors, they have developed a unique local culture, blending their ancestral heritage with elements of their host culture. The Wakhi language they speak, for instance, is significantly different from the Wakhi spoken in Tashqurghan and other Wakhi regions within and outside China. It has acquired sizable Turkic vocabularies, and its syntaxes and phonetics is seamlessly adjusted to accommodate these linguistic influences. That's partly due to the Uyghur language schooling and partly the result of political upheavals of the mid-20th century. The generation brought up during the Cultural Revolution 1966-76 had to abandon Wakhi for almost 2 decades. As a result, by the late 70s, the younger generation had difficulty communicating in their mother tongue. However, by 1980s, when the country adopted a more liberal ethnic policy, the Wakhis of Nourmamad embarked upon a mother tongue restoration campaign and successfully resuscitated Wakhi language, but with a local twist a little bit. For a Wakhi speaker from outside, their version of Wakhi language needs some getting used to, as the cadences and the vocabulary is a bit tricky to follow. But I do, because I speak both Wakhi and Uyghur. You have to know Uyghur to follow the conversation. Their religious practices also took on some local characteristics. As an Ismaili community, they had no local peers, and they depended on their khalifas for spiritual guidance and religious services. Because Nourmamad was isolated from other Ismaili areas in the province, they had irregular access to the hereditary peers based in Tashqurghan and Yarkand regions. As a result, some of the Khalifas trained in Sunni madrasas in Khotan gradually introduced some Sunni elements in their Ismaili traditions. For instance, the congregational prayers during the life cycle rituals, sacred site visitations, and religious festivals are slightly different from the similar rituals observed by the Ismailis in other parts of the province. Over time, they stopped practicing Shura Raushan, and it was replaced with the recitation of Quranic verses on the evening of entombment. But they still recognize Ismaili imams as their spiritual leaders and call their place of worship as Jamaat Khana. They have also adopted some Sufi practices observed by the local tariqas, Sufi tariqas in the region. For instance, the organized night vigils, known as tunak, during the special occasions in the local religious and cultural calendars, and chant zikr, visit burial places of local saints and awliyas, pray 5 times a day, fast during the Ramadan, and pay zakat on top of paying the Ismaili religious tax known as sarikori. The Wakhis in Nourmamadcho have gradually crafted a unique cultural identity by blending aspects from their past and present circumstances. While avoiding complete assimilation, they embrace changes that help them become part of the larger society without losing their ethnic, cultural, and religious heritage, while also affirming their Chinese nationality. Their journey is much like others scattered Wakhi communities in southern Xinjiang. Even though they mostly speak in Turkic dialects now, they still see themselves as Tajiks and Ismailis. They have faced difficulties, but have managed to keep their memories alive. This shows how people form their identity over time, and also underscores how memories and experiences shape who we are. Right now, the bigger picture that influenced their growth and adaptation is changing. Despite the challenges they face, we hope they can stay strong and eventually thrive. Thank you.